Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Mark Lambert, and this afternoon I'm talking to my friend Matt Gaspers. We're going to have another stab at doing the why the Pope isn't a heretic just because he says dodgy things video, mainly because the sound was so bad on the other one, for which I apologise. But the conversation was such a good conversation. I think it's so important, and it's something that comes up all the time. People, all the time are saying, no, he's not the Pope because he said X, Y, and Z. And so I think that this is an important conversation to have. What did you think of the Pope turning up in his pajamas at St. Peter's, Matt?
I thought it was, honestly, I felt sorry for him. I felt bad for him that his handlers would be so disrespectful to bring him out in public like that. That's my first thought. I worked in a nursing home for several years, many years ago, and it's just you don't do that to the elderly. That's so disrespectful. So honestly, that was my first thought, and I just thought it was very bizarre. Like, what is the purpose of this?
Especially that little kid. It was
Right.
when they had to explain who he was. It was
Right.
very strange, wasn't
I
it?
watched some of your video with Michael Hines from LifeSite News, and I thought his take was very good. Just very, it also is, it's not only disrespectful to the man, um, Francis, but also to the office of the papacy. It's not good for the faithful to see him in that state. And obviously we don't idolize the Pope and think that he's superhuman or something, but it's just totally unnecessary. I guess that's my ultimate take.
Very interesting. Again, another bizarre thing from this papacy of bizarre and curious things, isn't it? So basically
Reminds
what
me
we're
of the
going to
title
do
of
is,
that book, A Series of Unfortunate Events or something like that.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Uh,
So we're going to talk about the 5 opinions that Bellarmine covers in the Romano Pontifice, which are basically revolve around the fact that the basic argument is that if a pope says something heretical, he's no longer the pope. Would that be correct?
yeah, I think so. I'm going to be drawing from this English translation of De Romano Pontifice done by my friend Ryan Grant through his publishing house, Mediatrix Press. This is Tome 1, and I'll also be drawing from Tome 2, which is on the Church, also from Ryan Grant. So this is in Book 2, Chapter 30 of De Romano Pontifice, where Bellarmine is basically answering the question whether a heretical pope can be deposed. That's the subject of the chapter. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of our show last time, we're addressing and refuting two main claims that are made these days. Number one, that the claim that Bellarmine teaches that a manifestly heretical pope would automatically lose office without any involvement of the church, which is not correct. That's not actually what he teaches. And then number two, that it's against church teaching to even claim that a pope can become a manifest heretic, which is what someone claimed in response to our previous video. So those are the two main points I think we're addressing with this discussion. So yeah, just getting into the 5 opinions, I'll just start by explaining. So the first, Bellarmine lists 5. He goes through 5. The first of which is basically that a true pope can never become a heretic, and that was the one held by Albert Pigius, the Dutch theologian. And Bellarmine notes that the common opinion is to the contrary. And as we discussed last time, Vatican I specifically eschewed or distanced itself from Pigius's extreme opinion. And I want to read again, just because I think it's so important, that text from Bishop Vincent Ferrer Gasser, who was on the doctrinal committee for the draft of Pastor Eternus, the dogmatic constitution from Vatican I that defined papal infallibility. So this is what he
Well,
had
and
to
this is
say
the point,
regarding.
really, isn't it? Is that people would think Pastor Eternus gives more power to the Pope, makes his infallibility. That is the document of Vatican I that gives the Pope papal infallibility.
Right.
And so, and you'd think that therefore it was on the side of Pigius, but like you're gonna show now that it's not. that Vatican I
Exactly.
actually gives careful room for it for that not to be the case.
Right. So a week before Pastor Eternus was promulgated, and including the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility, Gasser gave a 4-hour intervention during which he explained the true meaning of the definition that they were considering in the draft. So he says, as far as the doctrine set forth in the draft of Pastor Eternus goes, the deputation, meaning the doctrinal commission, is unjustly accused of wanting to raise an extreme opinion, namely that of Albert Pigius, to the dignity of a dogma. There were council fathers who were expressing that concern during the council sessions, that they wanted to dogmatize this extreme minority opinion. So Gasser goes on, for the opinion of Albert Pigius, which Bellarmine indeed calls pious and probable, was that the Pope, as an individual person or a private teacher, was able to err from a type of ignorance, but was never able to fall into heresy or teach heresy. And Bellarmine did hold that it was pious and probable, but he did also acknowledge, as I mentioned, that the common opinion is to the contrary. But ultimately, Gasser goes on to say, the doctrine in the proposed chapter of Pastor Eternus, chapter 4, is not that of Albert Pigius or the extreme opinion of any school, but rather that it is one and the same which Bellarmine teaches in the place cited by the Reverend Speaker, someone else speaking during that intervention, and which Bellarmine adduces in the 4th place and calls most certain and assured, or rather correcting himself, the most common and certain opinion. So to give the background to that statement, in another place in De Romano Pontifice, Book 4, Chapter 2, he discusses, let me find this real quick here. Here we go. He discusses whether a judgment of the Pope is certain, and he lists the 4 opinions on that. The 3rd and the 4th are the ones that interest us. The 3rd opinion, Bellarmine says, is on another extreme, that the Pope cannot in any way be a heretic nor publicly teach heresy, even if he alone should define some matter, as Albert Pigius says. And that's basically the opinion of SEDEVACANTIST, which is who we're primarily addressing with this video. Bellarmine explains the 4th opinion is that in a certain measure, whether the Pope can be a heretic or not, he cannot define a heretical proposition that must be believed by the whole Church in any way. This, he says, is a very common opinion of nearly all Catholics. And that's what Vatican I taught, which is the truth. That when the Pope speaks, here, I'll read the definition like I did last time. This is what Vatican I actually taught. That the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when acting in the office of shepherd and teacher of all Christians, he defines, by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the universal Church, possesses through the divine assistance promised to him in blessed Peter, the infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed his Church to be endowed in defining the doctrine concerning faith or morals. So there are like 4 criteria in that definition that have to be met simultaneously in order for a papal statement to qualify as infallible. It's not everything that comes out of the man's mouth. So,
well, yeah, which is a relief, really.
yes. So, yeah, the first opinion, Bellarmine says the common opinion is to the contrary. So we need to, because that is the case, we should examine the other opinions. So then he goes on to opinion number 2, which is basically summarized as a pope who falls into heresy, even secret or like internal heresy, the sin of heresy, would immediately cut himself off from the Church and thus lose his office. And Bellarmine rejects this opinion, which was held by Cardinal Juan de Torquemada, who died in 1468, noting that its foundation, quote, is that secret heretics are outside the Church, which is false. And moreover, and very importantly, Bellarmine also observes this point, which totally contradicts the theory or the claim that he maintains that the Pope loses his office without any involvement of the Church whatsoever. He says, for jurisdiction is certainly given by the pontiff, given to the pontiff by God, but with the agreement of men, in other words, a conclave, as is obvious, he says. Because this man, who beforehand was not pope, has from men that he would begin to be pope, therefore he is not removed by God unless it is through men. So this clearly proves that Bellarmine held that men, specifically meaning members of the church's hierarchy, must be involved in establishing the fact that a pope suspect of heresy is indeed guilty of the crime. And for support for that, what I've just explained is found in this other tome that I showed earlier in his work on the church. In book 1, chapter 9, he's talking about councils, and he lists 6 reasons on account of which councils are celebrated. And the 4th reason, he says, is suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff. I'm quoting again from the book. If perhaps it might happen, or if he were an incorrigible tyrant, for then a general council ought to be gathered either to depose the pope, if he should be found to be a heretic. Notice he's saying to depose the pope. He's still acknowledging the man would still be a pope if he's simply suspect of heresy, if he should be found to be a heretic, or certainly to admonish him if he seemed incorrigible in morals. And he reiterates the same thing later on in this book in chapter 21. He says, quote, "The Roman pontiff cannot be deprived of his right to summon councils and preside over them unless he were first convicted by the legitimate judgment of a council and is not the supreme pontiff." He also goes on to say in that same chapter, the Pope in a council is not the only judge, but has many colleagues, that is, all the bishops, who, if they could convict him of heresy, they could also judge and depose him, even against his will. So clearly, Bellarmine held the church, the hierarchy, has to be involved in this. It doesn't just happen on its own.
It's a much more collegial approach, which makes sense when you think about the apostles and the fact that, the examples that we've got from within the apostles themselves, obviously Judas and St. Peter, who is the prince of the apostles, who was constantly getting things wrong. And it just feels to me that is the way that Christ set up the church, so that we've got a horizontal and a vertical dimension to the church, a horizontal dimension in the political reality of human existence on this plane, but also that connection to the divine all the time. And it's in that sense that the church is holy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we're all striving to be holy, and we hope that the Pope is leading us in that endeavour.
And as I mentioned, I've written some articles on this subject, as I mentioned during our last recording, and I provide, in one of those articles, I provide a quote from this book that I wanted to give a shout out to the authors who I know. I met them back in 2016, this book, True or False Pope, by John Salza and Robert Sisko. As you can see, it's very good sized, and it's really a unique and important treatise on this subject, refuting sedevacantism and other modern errors. And they explain the importance of the reason why the church, the hierarchy, needs to be involved with this process in order to give us moral certitude that the Pope has fallen. They explain, for if a Pope were able to fall from the pontificate without the church being aware of it, which is essentially what sedevacantists are claiming, that, the entire hierarchy and the vast majority of the faithful recognize Francis as the Pope. I mean, 99.9% of the hierarchy and the vast majority of the faithful recognize him as the Pope, and yet they're claiming he's not. So if that were able to happen, we would never know, explain Salza and Sisko, for sure, which popes in the past were true popes and which had crossed the line into heresy and lost their office. Hence, we would have no way of knowing if the definitive decrees of the various councils had been ratified by a real pope or by one who had lapsed into heresy for a time and secretly fallen from the pontificate. Consequently, they explained, the object of the faith itself, the dogmas that must be believed, would be uncertain, and the determination of which dogmas were defined by true popes and which were not would be left to the private judgment of individual Catholics in the pew to decide. The scrupulous would be paralyzed by doubt, and the unstable would fall into the most outrageous conclusions, which is ultimately what happens with people who go down that path. So,
yeah, that's really well put, actually, isn't it? And that's sort of the point of the church as a visible unity, isn't it? In the temporal flux of our reality, is that's sort of the function that it performs.
right. So we can move on to the third opinion that Bellarmine discusses. It's basically summarized as a pope who falls into heresy, even manifest, which means public and pertinacious heresy, as we'll see, retains his office and cannot be judged. Bellarmine calls this opinion, quote, exceedingly improbable, noting that, quote, in the case of heresy, a Roman pontiff can be judged. So again, reiterating the fact that he acknowledges that the church has to be involved in this, in the hierarchy. And regarding the word judge, he's not talking, he doesn't mean to say that the church or the bishops have some sort of juridical authority over the pope. It's basically an issue of fraternal correction. Like St. Thomas says in the Summa, let me, if I got this quote, I think somewhere here. He basically says, you know, if a superior is if there's a danger to the faith, that an inferior can correct a superior as a matter of fraternal correction. So it's not a matter of exercising jurisdiction over a superior. It's simply a matter of fraternal correction, as St. Thomas says in the Summa. I just wanted to clarify that point. Bellarmine also, when he's talking about the third opinion, he refers to something called the canon C Papa, which is a medieval canon, like a customary statute of canon law before it was all collected in more recent times into a single volume. There were different collections of church laws, and one of them was C Papa. And there's something by Pope Innocent III that he makes reference to when he's discussing the third opinion. So this is what C Papa says. I have a translation in this other book here from Dr. Kwasniewski's publishing house, Os Justi Press. So C Papa says, no mortal presumes in this regard to rebuke him, meaning the Pope, since the one who is to judge all men is himself to be judged by no one, unless perhaps he should be found straying or deviating from the faith. And then the text from Innocent III that Bellarmine cites when he's talking about the third opinion says, a pope can be judged by men, or rather be shown to be judged, if he loses his savor by way of heresy. For he who does not believe is already judged. So those are two sources that Bellarmine appeals to say, if we're dealing with heresy, the Pope is liable to judgment. And then so we can go on to the fourth opinion. And here's where I talked last time about there are two main schools of thought as to how a heretical pope would lose office. You have the Dominican school of thought, which is basically represented by this fourth opinion of Cajetan. And then the fifth opinion, which Bellarmine says is the true opinion, is what Salza and Cisco call the Jesuit school of thought in their book. So the fourth opinion is that of Cardinal Thomas Cajetan, who died in 1534. If I recall correctly, he was the cardinal that was involved with admonishing Martin Luther. He was involved in the case of Luther. And Bellarmine summarizes his position as, quote, a manifestly heretical pope, so one who has been warned by the church, fraternally corrected and spurned that, is not ipso facto deposed, but can and ought to be deposed by the church. And Bellarmine says such an opinion cannot be defended in his opinion, and then he gives his reasons. He says he gives one from authority and the other from reason. So he says the authority is of St. Paul, who commands Titus that after 2 censures, that is, after he appears manifestly pertinacious, a heretic is to be shunned. And he understands this before excommunication and sentence of a judge. So what he's referring to here, as I mentioned in a previous show that we did with Catherine and Gavin, all four of us, he's referring to Titus chapter 3, verses 10 to 11. And I'll just read that real quick so people know what I'm talking about here. So this is St. Paul's teaching in Scripture. A man that is a heretic after the first and second admonition or correction, avoid, knowing that he that is such a one is subverted and sinneth, being condemned by his own judgment. So that is what Bellarmine is talking about, that according to the Jesuit school of thought, all that needs to be established by the hierarchy is that he is obstinate in heresy, and then that's it. Then Christ does, after that's declared by the church that he is guilty of heresy, then Christ immediately severs the bond that unites the man to the office. Now, the Dominican opinion on this, or this Dominican school of thought, says there needs to be an additional step on the part of the church to dispose the Pope to lose his office, and that is that the church needs to command, the hierarchy needs to command the faithful to avoid the heretical Pope. And that is what disposes him to lose office, for Christ to separate the man from the office. But they both agree, as I explained in our previous discussion, they both agree on two basic points. The first is the church hierarchy must be involved in, number one, establishing pertinacity or obstinance on the part of the allegedly heretical Pope by means of those warnings that St. Paul mentions in Titus chapter 3. And then number two, declaring the fact of his pertinacity if he spurns fraternal correction, in order to give the faithful moral certitude that he has indeed lapsed into formal heresy. Both schools of thought agree on those two basic points.
And it makes you wonder why, I mean, we're kind of in that situation, do you think? A little bit now.
How do you mean that there are?
Well, we've got a situation where the Pope has, I mean, obviously there are still some people arguing that he's not a manifest heretic. But it seems, I mean, even, was it last week we had the man that he's put in charge of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, which is the office which is responsible for teaching the faith to us, the lay people, contradicting his own document, Dignitatis Infinita, which was clear on, unusually for this papacy, one might say, it didn't prevaricate on the issue of transgenderism. And yet in a video conversation he had with some German theologians, he gave ground on that and said that it can be allowed. So that's just one example. But you could also say, I mean, the one that always comes to the forefront of my mind is the Pachamama incident, which lots of people have tried to say, oh, it was, it wasn't an idol, it was. But I mean, just even if the point for me was that the Pope never explained it. He called it Pachamama. He never said, no, this represents, there was no attempt to explain what was actually going on, other than from people like Austin Ivory and Mike Lewis, who were desperately trying to spin it into something that it clearly wasn't.
Right.
Also, you had the dreadful prayer from the Italian bishops, Pachamama of these places, all that nonsense going on. I mean, that is smacking you in the face heresy, isn't it? Idolatry and all, to install an idol in the Vatican garden and to have a sort of prayer service going on around it. It was appalling, wasn't it, Matt?
Yeah, it certainly was. All of this started, as we recall, I mean, the claims that Francis has fallen into heresy started, I think, primarily after Amoris Laetitia was issued in March or April of 2016.
Right at the beginning,
and then,
basically.
yeah, from relatively the beginning. He was elected in March of 2013, and from 13 to 16 said some questionable, scandalous things. Beginning with the World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro and telling the young people to go out and make a mess, and then on the way home, his infamous "Who am I to judge" comment. So it's just been pretty much nonstop from there. But I think, yeah, so we do have a divide in the church among those who try to defend what Francis is doing, or, the Pope-splainers, I guess is the word we would use. And then those who are saying, no, he has said things that are objectively wrong and something needs to be done. What we really need is not dubia, as has been issued on a couple of occasions, once in 2016, another, and I think in 2023. What we need are those formal, what Cardinal Burke has referred to in the past as a formal correction of the Roman pontiff. That they need to admonish him fraternally, correct him fraternally, and say, Holy Father, with all due respect, what you've said here is objectively erroneous and even heretical, and you have to recant this. You cannot hold this position and remain Catholic. And for whatever reason, they don't do that. But honestly, even if they did, as we heard from Bellarmine, he and the other great theologians who have addressed this topic didn't envision just a handful of cardinals going and admonishing the Pope. They envisioned this happening in the context of a general council of the church. Like the entire hierarchy would have to be on board for this to work. And ultimately, I think that's why Bishop Schneider, before we get to the fifth opinion, I'll just comment on this like I did last time. I think that's why Bishop Schneider holds the position that he does. And he rightly observes, he wrote in 2019 for an article for 1 Peter 5 on this topic. He said, the issue of how to handle a heretical pope in concrete terms has not yet been treated in a manner which approaches anything like a true general consent in the entire Catholic tradition. So far, neither a pope nor an ecumenical council has made relevant doctrinal pronouncements, nor have they issued binding canonical norms regarding the eventuality of how to handle a heretical pope during the term of his office. The opinion which says that a heretical pope ipso facto loses his office became a common opinion starting with the High Middle Ages until the 20th century. It remains a theological opinion and not a teaching of the Church, and therefore it cannot claim the quality of a constant and perennial teaching of the Church as such, since no ecumenical council and no pope has supported such an opinion explicitly. So, the Jesuit opinion, the Dominican opinion on these things are valid opinions, but I don't think we can say that they go beyond the realm of opinion. It's not certain how to deal with this situation because we've never had a definitive pronouncement from the magisterium on it.
Which makes it very difficult, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Should we move on then to the last?
Yes. So what Bellarmine says, he says now the fifth true opinion, the one that he held, is that a pope who is a manifest heretic, remember, he's talking about one that's manifestly pertinacious after he's been warned, per Titus chapter 3, ceases in himself to be pope and head, just as he ceases to be in himself a Christian and a member of the body of the church, whereby he can be judged and punished by the church. So again, just to reiterate and emphasize, the Jesuit school on this issue claims that after the church has established that the Pope is indeed a heretic, at that moment, Christ severs the bond, or it's actually, I think they might even hold that it's already happened, that Christ has already severed the bond between the man and the office, and the church does not play any sort of a ministerial role in the severing of the bond. But the Dominican school says that in order for Christ to intervene and actually sever the bond uniting the man to the office, the church has to issue a declaration commanding the faithful to avoid the heretical pope, and then Christ severs the man from the office at that point. But again, both agree that the hierarchy has to be involved in establishing the fact that he is pertinacious, that he is a heretic, and then has to declare that to the faithful to give us all the moral certitude that he is indeed pertinacious. So
Yeah, like Pope Francis has been warned, hasn't he? We've had when he signed the Abu Dhabi document saying that God wills a plurality of religions. We know that Bishop Snyder confronted him about it, but he kind of slipped out of it a bit, saying that it was God's permissive will that allowed that, wasn't it? But like there are a number of instances where certainly, like Father Thomas Wynandy, who's a really outstanding theologian, was the advisor to the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, had lost his role because he said that Pope Francis is a heretic. Father Aidan Nichols, who's the UK's leading theologian, Dominican, similarly got into all kinds of trouble because he signed an open letter stating that Pope Francis was a heretic. So we're not without examples. Obviously, we've got the dubia. The first lot of dubia were never answered, and the second lot, which was that we know about anyway. This was the ones that we thought would provoke this correction, formal correction from Cardinal Burke, but hasn't manifested. It hasn't manifested. You've got Cardinal Muller, the former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, saying that the things that are being taught are heretical. It's fairly out in the open, isn't it? That he's on very thin ice, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more out in the open than it ever has been. The only other, as I said in our last discussion, the only other historical case that comes anywhere close to this, even though it wasn't actually dealing with heresy, formally speaking, was the case of John the 22nd back in the 1300s, who publicly preached in 3 successive sermons that the souls of the faithful departed, even if they've already been purified in purgatory, that they will not enjoy the beatific vision until after Christ comes again in glory in the final judgment, and then we will, which was a minority opinion at the time, and ended up being contrary to the faith, as his successor dogmatically defined the opposite, that no, the faithful departed, whether they go straight to heaven or they need to be purified in purgatory, once they're in heaven, they immediately enjoy the beatific vision even before the final judgment. Now, in that case, people were very up in arms publicly, theologians, even civil authorities, and they publicly corrected him, challenged him on it, and he accepted that correction and ultimately recanted on his deathbed and said that he didn't mean to go against the teaching of the church, and he submits his opinions to the judgment of the church, something like that. And then his successor defined the truth of the matter. But unfortunately, so what we really need, it's not enough, unfortunately, for for them to issue dubia or say, generally speaking, he's saying erroneous things. They have to issue an actual formal correction and say, you have to recant X, Y, and Z. If you don't, you're going to be showing yourself as pertinacious or obstinate in heresy, and that's a problem,
Yeah. Well, Matt, I'm so sorry we're going to have to leave it there. It's absolutely fascinating topic. And I'd ask everyone, please do leave a comment if you've got a question or something that you'd like us to clear up for you, some question for Matt. Please do leave it down in the comment section, and we'll come back and we'll talk about it, because this is something that's really relevant in the church today. A lot of people are struggling with a lot of these issues, so I think it's great to sort of get it out there and in an intelligent way discuss what's going on and what the church has taught before. And it's great to be on the side of the church, isn't it? Rather than the side of the sedevacantists themselves. So please do like, share, and subscribe, and we'll catch up with you very soon on Catholic Unscripted. Thanks very much for watching.